folks, welcome back to Indaba Africa. This is Chris once again. Hello, folks, and welcome back to Chris Wyatt Africa. It's Sunday, September 5th, 2021. Where does the time go? Well, welcome back to the program. It's a pleasure to have you today. I have a special featured guest, none other than advocate Mark Oppenheimer, who recently appeared before the Constitutional Court in South Africa regarding Independent Electoral Commission's case to have the election date moved. Mark, how are you today?
Excellent. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's my distinct pleasure. You and I chatted right after you appeared before the court that day. I congratulate you on a brilliant, my view, of course, I'm a layperson, a brilliant performance before the court, well laid out arguments. And I asked you to come on the chat and you said, happy to do it, but we have to wait until a decision is reached. Well, we reached that decision and here we are today. So welcome back to the program. It's a pleasure to have you back. I know a lot of people are asking to get you back on, so I'm pretty excited to get started talking about this. But before we do, I think you've heard the news that one former President Jacob Zuma has been granted medical parole. I have here in my grubby hands a press release from the Department of Correctional Services, which says that he has been granted medical parole. Now, not to pretend that I'm Nostradamus or Senior Fun Wyatt, but I did predict on the 29th of June when he was convicted that within 30 to 90 days, there's a minimum period he has to sign, but within that minimum period, he would be granted medical parole. And son of a gun, Jacob Zuma got medical parole. Wow, I tell you what, this guy should go to Vegas because he wins. Always bet on Zuma. So any thoughts on that before we get talking about the Constitutional Court decision on the elections?
There's one little bit in that notice that you might see, which is it says they've got the discretion to do with people who've been convicted of sentences less than 24 months. Mm-hmm. Now, the Constitutional Court's conviction was 15 months, but Zuma, of course, faces many more charges. And so it's an interesting question whether, if the plan is to grant a medical parole for anything, whether there's any point in persisting in these further cases against him. I mean, you might think symbolically it's important to know whether he's guilty or not and for the nation to know in a trial. But it might be that you can't grant him medical parole under those provisions, at least, if the sentences were higher.
Well, it does raise all sorts of questions. I mean, for instance, this was for contempt of court. And in my judgment, he's been in contempt of court at least twice since then. He failed to turn himself in by the 4th of July, which put him in contempt, but they never charged him. Then he failed to submit himself for medical examination by the National Prosecuting Authority. In my view, that's contempt. Again, that's twice they've not even charged him with it. And then beyond that, of course, the original case that goes back to the arms deal, which is from the 1990s. And that's what we're trying to get him in court for, is to appear before that. So if any other charges are made, what happens then if they convict him of another 15 months? Is this added to this and then it doesn't count? It's a separate, discrete conviction. There's all kinds of crazy questions here. And I don't know. But as I said, Jacob Zuma would see very little jail time. It looks like that's the case. What I found interesting about the medical thing, Mark, is that suddenly, after he was incarcerated, his physician comes forward and says he experienced a serious medical event in November of 2020. That's 10 months ago. And he must spend 6 months in hospital now. Why did he spend 6 months in hospital from November until now? That's the kind of medical condition I want to get. I'm just saying.
It's one of those like time-lapse pills, it only takes effect after 6 months. Everything's fine before then.
That must be what it was. All right, well, that's the interesting news for today for folks. If you don't know, Jacob Zuma has been granted medical parole, and it's all on the table now. Of course, he's supposed to appear in court on the 10th of September, I think, for the arms deal. We'll see if that happens now. I suppose if he's in his villa somewhere resting on a respirator, maybe he can appear before court. We'll see what happens there. But
hey, we have Zoom hearings nowadays. If you can't track off, down to the Pietermaritzburg High Court, we can always put a little laptop on your tummy, and you can testify through that.
Well, there you go. Well, that's what made the whole silly argument that he couldn't get a fair trial because he's in prison nonsense. People are tried in prison all the time around the world in different cases, and people are tried in absentia. He can dress him up, put a pretty suit and a lovely tie on, and he can do a Zoom. We can put a green screen behind him. He doesn't have to look like he's in prison. So Duvall just gave a super chat. Said my prediction 5 years ago that he is an older man and would says Dev. Develop dementia. An 80-year-old with dementia will never go to jail. Well, suppose that may be a good point there. But Mark, you appeared before the Constitutional Court recently, and this had to do with the Independent Electoral Commission's decision to move forward based on a report from former Deputy Justice Moseneke, who recommended that it wasn't possible for South Africa to hold free and fair elections in the midst of the pandemic. Now, I pointed out, as have many others, including many of your fellow advocates who spoke before the court, that other African countries have held elections successfully. And now I pointed out Somaliland, a country barely recognized, and the Central African Republic, a failed state where South African troops were recently deployed to, had an election. Ethiopia, which is in the midst of a civil war and has terrorism throughout the country, although 25% of the population couldn't vote, they still held an election. Zambia just held a successful election. Of course, probably the scariest election for all of the ANC is the fact that the Namibia held an election, municipal elections in November last year, and got its hat handed to it, SWAPO. So the ruling party took a big hit in Namibia, and maybe that's what the ANC fears. But the Independent Electoral Commission went to the court based on that recommendation from that study and said it wasn't possible, even though 115 countries around the world had elections, yada, 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 yada. And that was the crux of the argument, that wasn't able to do it, based on what I would consider to be phony science information, but we could debate that. Whatever the case is, you spoke on behalf of a client there, and can you tell us a little bit about the case so that people understand what the case was about before we delve into it?
Yes, sure. So as you say, it came out of this report from Moseneke. I will say this, which is, I found the report to be incredibly transparent in the sense that it showed all sides. So Deputy Justice Moseneke doesn't hide the fact that elections were held in many countries around the world. To add to that list, Canada at the moment are going to have a snap election. Justin Trudeau has decided to have an election early because he thinks it would be in his electoral interests. So that gives you a sense that you've had elections all over the world, and the Canadians, think it's so safe to run an election that you could do one now. Even when it's not necessary, But Moseneke guides that, So if you look at the evidence that's in that report, you have a whole range of parties who participated. You had civil society, you had political parties, you had different kinds of scientists, and ultimately what you have is the ability as a member of the public to look at all that evidence and say, well, at least I don't feel like this is biased in some sort of way. So you could see all the arguments in favor of a postponement and all the arguments against the postponement. And ultimately, Moseneke says, look, my view is it can't be free and fair. You should postpone until February. The Electoral Commission then launched litigation when they approached the Constitutional Court on an urgent basis. Now, it's an interesting thing to do because you've got a very small window of time. Basically, they accepted that they have to run an election before the 1st of November, and one had been set to be the 27th of October. It had been set by the Minister of Cooperative Governance, who proclaimed a date. Now, the difficulty with that date being proclaimed was that it meant anyone who hadn't been registered couldn't vote. There's a sort of technical requirement. So you now had the situation where it looked like to some a sort of coordinated fait accompli. We say, well, look, we can't register anyone. Everybody's got to accept that if you deny these people the right to vote, that's not free and fair. So, we'd like a postponement, please. Now, what the Electoral Commission did was sort of try and give a series of arguments in favor of why it needed a postponement. It said, look, the science is uncertain. Some of the scientists are telling us that, October would be a good time to have an election. Because we'll have a dip in COVID waves. But we can never be certain. We can never, sort of see the future. Others are saying that February would be a good time. Professor Karim, in particular, said it would be a bad time. And so this was, something that was made much of in court. But ultimately, they said, look, there's a series of factors besides that election day that make it free and unfair. It's that people haven't been able to canvass. People are unregistered. We haven't had these large political gatherings that are, a usual thing in South Africa, these big mass rallies. And so for all those reasons and the sort of, small time left available to the Electoral Commission, not free and fair. They were supported by a couple of other organizations. So the ANC supported them, as did the IFP. They asked for different dates. The ANC said, look, we think April would be a fair time, and I think the IFP asked for May. The EFF, interestingly, and this you'll see will become very important. The EFF came and said, look, if you don't grant a postponement, the one thing that we would like is that you change the electoral timetable, which creates a cutoff date of 23 August for parties to have their candidates registered. So bear in mind, it's a municipal election, and you're going to have, thousands of candidates running in these elections. Moseneke described it as 4,753 different elections that were happening. So they said, look, you need to extend that time so that people can get their candidates registered. Then you had those that were opposing. So the DA and the MEC for the Western Cape were supported then by CASAC and by, I think, ATM and Institute for Race Relations, who I acted for, saying you ought not to postpone. Now, they had different arguments for why you ought not to postpone. To give you an idea of the two arguments that were raised by the Electoral Commission on this, the one was to say, look, we have these different obligations in terms of the Constitution. The one is we have to provide a free and fair election. Okay? And we recognize that everyone has this right to adult universal suffrage. We also recognize that Section 159 of the Constitution says we have to have an election every 5 years, but you're allowed a 90-day window. And we're saying we can't meet that obligation. Now, the one argument is to say it's not possible for us to have a free and fair election. Therefore, we haven't breached any obligations. You can't be asked to do the impossible. You cannot oblige someone to fly, for example. This was the one argument. The other one was to say, look, maybe it is the case that we've broken our constitutional obligations. Then the court must declare that we've done that. But then it must exercise its remedial powers in terms of Section 172 of the Constitution, exercising a just and equitable remedy, and say, you've breached your obligations, but we're going to delay the declaration of your breach until a later date, February, and then let you have an election then. So the arguments countering that were, the one was to say, look, this idea of constitutional impossibility is a very dangerous doctrine. It's a common law doctrine. It's the kind of thing we find in contracts. So, for example, I say to you, I promise you I'm going to deliver you, this bushel of wheat, by this date, and then the bushel of wheat gets burnt down. It becomes impossible for me to deliver the contract. So we can't require you to do the impossible. The argument is that that kind of doctrine can't apply in constitutional cases. The Constitution is supreme. Section 1 of our Constitution says it is the supreme law, as the Section 2. So these are foundational values. And ultimately, it's not the court that's the highest law in the land. It's the Constitution, and the court is the guardian of the Constitution. They then said this idea that the court could declare a remedy that entitles a constitutional breach also cannot be countenanced. It cannot be just and equitable to allow someone to breach the Constitution. So those are the kind of arguments that were raised on the legal stuff. But then there were arguments on the facts. They say, look, if you have the power to do this, you ought not to exercise that power. And some of those arguments we've already discussed, this idea that, hold on, all these other countries in the world have run elections. Michel Leroux for CASAC said, you have 18 million people in South Africa who receive social grants. And every single month, those people go and they queue at post offices or SAS offices, and they go and get the grants. And we don't see a spike in COVID cases on those days. So, the idea that a queue is the same as a gathering is not the same. Michael Bishop for the DA said, look, the Electoral Commission say that they can't do it, it's not possible. He says, let me tell you about all the cases where the Electoral Commission was before this court before, yep, where they had very, very short timelines to do things that seemed impossible. And they did it. So the examples he gave was there were prisoners who have a constitutional right to vote in South Africa. You don't have that in the States.
Thank God.
But in South Africa, you have the right. And there's an interesting reason why you might think you should have that right, which is that as a prisoner, you are one of the most controlled people. And you might not want to support a law that's going to make your life more and more miserable. You might want to vote for a party that's going to, make your prison conditions better. You can also imagine people who are falsely imprisoned, people who are imprisoned for things that we think ought not to be crimes.
Fair points. But from my perspective, someone who commits a felony has broken the rules of society and doesn't have a right to have a voice in what society decides. That's a personal view. So.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's a debatable topic. You can think that, for example, if you are losing certain freedoms, everybody accepts that if you're going to be imprisoned, you're losing the freedom of movement. So maybe other freedoms fall away. South Africa, we recognize that right.
Yep.
But the Electoral Commission hadn't set up the infrastructure to allow these prisoners to vote. And so they challenged it, and they were successful. And the court then created this supervisory interdict to ensure that those guys got to vote. And they had a very small time frame. I think they had 6 weeks. And the IC made it happen. It was 120,000 prisoners that were then able to vote. You had a similar thing where it was decided that South Africans living abroad didn't lose their voting rights, and that they should be able to vote even if they live in another country. And this also was decided very, very soon before an election. And the IC made it happen. And you had to do it in international scale. You had to ensure that there was a system in place for various consulates or embassies, so that South Africans living in all parts of the world, Dubai, Australia, America, wherever it was, could vote, and they made it happen. So they said this is a similar situation. You've got an unusual event that has occurred. You've known about it since February 2020. You've had enough opportunity to kind of prepare for it. Other countries around the world are prepared for it. You should be able to do it. So those are the kinds of arguments that were there on the facts and on the law.
But Mark, let me interrupt for just a second. Sorry, but wasn't there even a more poignant example? I think it was the UDM that was a party that was or was deregistered in the Western Cape or something like that, less than a week before the elections, and the IEC intervened within like 72 hours of the election, something like that, very short notice, and put them back on the ballot. Isn't that? I mean, that's the most extreme. By comparison, there is a wealth of time compared to that event. Did I get that wrong, or is that close?
Look, the famous case that I recall is in South Africa's first democratic elections. And so the IFP had been threatening to boycott the elections. And they sort of said, we don't think this is a legitimate process. We're not gonna participate. And that would have created a crisis because the IFP had a lot of support. Yep. At the time, there were lots of ethnic tensions. You had violence between ANC members and IFP members. And so the idea of having the election where everybody participated was seen as very important. But they said, we're not doing it. And the IC now had to print ballots. And so what Mandela said was, print the ballots without them on it, but create a space so that we can include them if they decide to change their minds. And 10 days before the election, they said, you know what, we'll participate. And they put stickers on the ballots. Now, interestingly enough, one of the questions that came up in court, this was asked by Deputy Chief Justice Zondo, and it's a good question to ask because you're trying to test a principle. And he asked it first to counsel for the MEC for the Western Cape. And he said, look, the question is, do we have this power to postpone the elections? So I want you to imagine a hypothetical case. Mm-hmm. So the hypothetical case is that parties come to us and they say, here is evidence that the election that is going to happen in 5 days will not be free and will not be fair. He says, we look at the evidence as the court and we are 100% satisfied that it is true. He says, what can we do? He says, are we allowed to declare that this election, which is going to happen in 5 days, is unfree and unfair? If we can do that, can we say, given that it is unfree and unfair, can we say that, and if we assume that the reason for why it is unfree and unfair is because of that date, can we say you are now authorized to have the election after that period? And assume, for the sake of argument, to make it analogous, that'll be after the 90 days has expired. And he gives another example. He says, imagine that we find an election has been unfree and unfair. We look at it, look back in time, we go, everyone agrees, and we declare it unfree and unfair. And we say, you have to have a new election in that ward. Necessarily, it'll be after the 90 days. So he says, we have that power to direct elections to be after the 90 days in the Constitution. Can we do it in advance? And the example, so this was debated between the parties, and a lot of people sort of thought, initially the council said, no, you can't do it, and then could sort of see the rub of that. It seems quite, like a very bad result to occur. And Stephen Budlander for the Electoral Commission said, let me flesh that case out for you. He says, imagine if the DA discovered that all of the ballots that have been printed don't have their name on it. He says, everyone would accept that it was unfree and unfair. You'd have reason not to have the election. Now, of course, there's the irony in that particular case because we've actually been through that in South Africa. We didn't have a party on the ballots, and we found a way. We found a solution. Now, here's the interesting thing. So we can sort of get to the surprise. I'll tell you a bit about what the IR did, but the court has delivered judgment, and the court said, we are dismissing the Electoral Commission's case. No postponement will be granted. They found that the decision to declare an election on the 27th of October by the cogent minister was irrational and unconstitutional and invalid and was set aside. And they did that because they said, well, I'll say why I can't quite explain why they said it, but the implication is that it's because it would have had the effect of all these voters not being able to be registered. So that was set aside, and now she's been directed to set a new date. And the IEC have been given 3 days from the date of judgment to determine whether they can have a registration weekend.
Well, that's tomorrow. That's tomorrow.
Yeah. So we'll know then whether the IEC say they can have a registration weekend. They said at the time in the hearing they could do one. I think they said it was the weekend of the 10th and 11th, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Now, real quick, I'm kind of confused by something here. You've just alluded to it. You've talked about this. And Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma's decision to set the election on the 27th of October. I thought that it was required for the government to set the date in advance of that 90-day window. And so that's where I was confused. Is the argument here not that she's setting the date is unconstitutional, but the fact that it basically eliminated an opportunity for registration weekend? Is that what was unconstitutional?
Yes.
Okay.
So I'll explain that a little bit. So here's the little bit.
I mean, don't get me wrong. Anything that NDZ says that is declared unconstitutional, I'm all in favor of it. But go ahead.
Here's the little complication in terms of why I can't tell you the exact reason from the court. Because what we have is an order. In other words, the court has said this is the result, and they have said reasons to follow. Now, that's unusual in one way, in the sense that ordinarily litigation before the Constitutional Court takes a very long time to get to the Constitutional Court. I was in the matter of Kwalani, which the court delivered a couple of weeks ago, and that litigation comes down to facts from 2008, and we'd argued our case in 2020. So often the court's got a long time to deliberate, and you get the order and the reasons simultaneously. But in urgent cases, and often you have high courts dealing with this, they say, look, it's so urgent that we need to tell you what's going to happen so that you can comport your life accordingly. In this case, run an election. We'll tell you why afterwards. And that's what the Constitutional Court has done. So we don't know why. And I'm not going to take any guesses as to why. But I can tell you what the arguments were. So I can tell you the kinds of things that the court was considering. But we don't know why they've come to their judgment. We also know that it's a judgment of the majority of the court, which means it's possible that it's not unanimous and that there's some dissent. And there are different ways that dissent could be cashed out. It could be that everybody agrees on the relief, but for different reasons. That's a possibility. But yeah, so the idea was that Dlamini-Zuma, the law says, look, you have to proclaim an election date within this sort of window. Mm-hmm. Okay. But it doesn't say exactly when that window could be. So she had discretion as to it. But she knew that the consequence of proclaiming the date was everyone who wasn't registered couldn't vote. And so we can assume that that's the reason why it was irrational. In other words, you're disenfranchising all these people. And that's why it's been lifted and people will not get an opportunity. The IC had intended on running registration weekends. They hadn't done it because of the lockdown levels that were in place. Here's the bit that's interesting is I mentioned to you what the EFF case was, mm-hmm. which was to say the timetable must be amended so that you can allow candidate registration. The order specifically dismisses that relief. Now, why does that matter? It matters because the ANC haven't registered a large number of candidates.
Oh, this is true. At least 90 wards, they have 0 candidates listed.
Yes. Now, from what I understand, there's 2 different kinds of candidates that you can have in these kinds of elections. The one is the ward councillor candidate. Okay. So if you think about a first past the poll system, which you have in the States. Okay. So you're voting for, let's say, a particular senator. You know, if that senator gets the majority vote, they get the seat. All the other votes become worthless, basically. So that's often why in first past the poll systems, third parties do very badly. So, in the States, basically, it's a 2-party system because of first past the polls. In South Africa, we have a mixed system at municipal level, which is that you vote for that guy, and when you have 2 votes. The first is, I want this particular ward councillor to represent me. I like him. Maybe I don't care what his party affiliation is. He's a member of my community. I pick him. But then I have a second vote, which is I vote for a party. And those votes are then represented in terms of proportional representation votes. So you have councillors who are PR councillors. Now, from what I understand, if you put one person or more on your list of PR councillors, then you're okay. Then you can say, look, here's our one guy, we're in, and now you can supplement the list later. If you put no PR councillors on the list, then there is no box for anyone to check at when they vote because you didn't put any candidates forward, so that party will not be represented on the ballot. And it sounds like the ANC are in that situation for both cases. In other words, there are some wards where there's no candidate, and there are some areas where there's no PR candidate at all, in which case people can't vote for the ANC. Now, why is this the case? This is the case because the ANC hasn't been paying its salaries to its staff for months, and they went on a go-slow. And they said, we are not going to do the work of registering these candidates because we're not willing to work after hours until you pay us. And it's also come out that the way it works in South Africa is you have a PAYE system. So you deduct from your employees' taxes, which you then are meant to pay over to the South African Revenue Service, your IRS. And the ANC did the deductions. They just didn't pay it over to SARS. So they owe
they kept the money.
They kept the money. So they owe $80 million to Treasury.
So how about some jail time for that one?
Yeah, I mean, you have a problem here, right? In other words, so you have a situation with the staff saying, hold on, so you're not paying us our salaries. You took off our SARS deductions, and then you didn't even pay it to SARS. We're not going to help you do overtime work now that you need it. So this is this interesting situation. In other words, it's not that through all these lockdown regulations or the IEC that the ANC weren't able to get their candidates registered. ATM, which is a party that Jimmy Manya, who you all may know as President Zuma's spokesperson, he's involved in that party. It's a very small party. I think they have 2 or 3 members in parliament. They say they got 4,000 people registered on their candidate lists. They say we got our ducks in a row. All the other parties got their ducks in a row. They got their candidates ready. It doesn't look very unfair if you're the only party that seems to get advantages because of all the other stuff that happened.
To be fair, it's not just the ANC. The UDM also failed to get many of its candidates registered for wards. That's a smaller party. Excuse me. Drawing a blank right now. General Bantu Holomisa, party. They also failed. But they are also one of the groups that was arguing. They didn't take part in this case, but they argued for the election being later. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I just want to point out it's not just the ANC, but yeah, the ANC is the most embarrassing to say the least here.
Yeah. Now, why does this matter? So, it matters because if you read the court order as it stands,
it
says, look, you must run the election. If you can register people, have the registration weekend. You got to tell us on Monday whether you can do that. If you can't do that, you still got to run the election, and you got to run that election between 27th of October and the 1st of November. That's clear. Then says, look, you are entitled to amend the election timetable insofar as it is necessary for voter registration. Okay. So voter registration is different from candidate registration.
Sure.
And we have the sense that the EFF specifically asked for a change to the timetable for candidate registration, and the court said no, application dismissed.
Yep.
Okay. So we have good reason to think that the court definitely has not countenanced the idea that you could go and late register candidates. All right. But section, I think it's 11 of that Electoral Act says that the IEC can amend the timetable if it finds that it would be that the election is not going to be free and fair. Okay. So now the ball's in their court to determine, well, has something that's not free and not fair occurred, which would give us the power to go and amend the timetable, and amending that timetable would allow for candidate registration. Mm-hmm. So that is, I think, a hovering question before us as to whether they exercise that power. But it definitely isn't something that follows from the judgment of the court. In fact, the court seems to think otherwise on that front.
Well, let me do a little bit of housekeeping here real quick, Mark. Thank you. So, folks, you're listening to Chris Wyatt Africa here on the Indaba Africa channel, Sunday, the 5th of September, 2021. My special featured guest is none other than Advocate Mark Oppenheimer, who recently spoke before South Africa's apex court, the Constitutional Court, the Supreme Court in the land, about the request by the Independent Electoral Commission to have the elections delayed, and we're discussing some of the key points coming out of that. But I've got a couple super chats here, and I got to recognize Paulie, our resident firefighter, says top guest as always, thumbs up twice. He's a big fan, and he was really excited when he found out you're going to be on again. Lynn also gave a super chat. Thank you, Lynn, for the super chat. Now, Mark, I've got a question for you that's a little confusing for me. You know, I'm pretty switched on. I know South Africa very well, but this is something I've never understood. Why a registration weekend? As an American, I can go register to vote any day of the year. Now, there's a limit before the election, and before we perverted our election laws in this state last year, before the election, you had to be registered 2 weeks prior. If you weren't registered 2 weeks prior, and prior to that, it used to be 30 days, so people couldn't be messing with the electoral rolls. But why a weekend? Or is that just a phrase? Or why can't people just go, it's June 5th. Why can't I go, I've moved to a new ward, I want to register? Is there some mechanism or reason behind that? Do you know? Because it's confusing me because, just open registration right now and run it till October 1st or, October, something like that.
Yes. So part of it is the concern was that the IEC before hadn't. They had an obligation to ensure that everyone who votes in a particular area actually lives there. And so there's a case that said you've got to go. There's 12 million people who are registered, and we don't know where they live. And so the worry is what parties are doing is that they're basically gerrymandering through busing. So what you do is you say, look, there's a place we're losing, but we've got a lot of supporters close by where we know we're going to win there. So if we can just move those guys and get them to vote somewhere else, then we can win there. And so we can have a mayor, and they kind of have funny gerrymandering that's gone on where you mentioned it in our prior discussion, where you combine local councils together. So you sort of try and drown out, the other councils, and you can make sure that as the big party you can beat them. So this was sort of viewed as a problem, and so the court said, look, you have to go and get all these guys' addresses. And so one of the things that came out of that was then you have to be able to, the parties need to be able to inspect these rolls. So you've got everyone's addresses. The IEC were obliged to do this, by the way, by 2018. The court had set a date for them. They didn't do it. And they say now that they're almost done with it. But they, so in other words, it took an enormous amount of effort to get this thing done. But the idea is they said, look, the parties must have an opportunity to check those rolls and see if there's anything fraudulent that's gone on. And that's why you need to have a distance between the registration time and the election. That's why there has to be a kind of cutoff so that there's an inspection period and you can check, okay, well, we think these guys are legit. They live here. They're not dead, those sorts of things. So it's to ensure the elections are free and fair. What the IEC did do was they said, look, we recognize you've got these COVID protocols in place and it's going to make it difficult for us to have these mass gatherings people can vote. So let's have an online system. The online system seems to have not worked very well for various reasons, and they only registered about 17,000 people.
Yeah, I was going to say 16, 17,000 was what was reported, yep.
Yeah. But going forward, you might find that, things like that are a good idea, that, South Africa does have a lot of rural poor, but we also have more cell phones in South Africa than people. And it might be that, through time, people are able to, and because things like WhatsApp are so widely used in South Africa, people are much more tech savvy than they would have been 10 years ago. And maybe you just try and make those systems, easier, better. You could zero rate them for data usage. So there are things that could be done.
Oh, I thought I heard a knock there. It must have been on your end. Yeah, no, that's a good point because, here in the U.S., most people have free data. Unlimited data is usually what you get. I mean, thankfully, that wasn't the case 10 or 15 years ago. We were paying more for data than most people, which was ridiculous. But now most phone contracts, because they're usually contracts, there aren't many. You can't just buy a SIM card and stick it in over here. But most of it's, you have no charge for the data. So people don't even think about the cost of actually registering. I mean, but it's real in Africa. Most of Africa, people are paying for airtime and for that data. But as you said, the mobile carriers could zero rate that. The government could ask them or direct them to not charge for that sort of data usage, and that would make it fairer. And as you mentioned, there's more cell phones than there are South Africans, certainly more than there are registered voters. What gets me, though, is I'm hearing different things and reading different things about how many people are actually registered. I've read that 25.7 million people are registered, but then during the case, it was repeatedly mentioned 15 plus million people registered. I really don't know what the actual number is here. Does the IEC know?
I'm not sure what that disparity refers to. We do know, for example, there's people who are eligible to vote who are not registered, and that number is very large.
That's about 38 million, I think, is the total number of people that are eligible to vote in South Africa, something like that.
That sounds about right. So we have roughly 55 to 60 million people in South Africa. Obviously, there's a lot of people who are not South Africans who can't vote.
Right.
But, and then, voting age is 18, and we have quite a young population. But if you look at, who do people vote for, the largest class is those that don't vote, that have sort of opted out, and they might be opting out for a range of reasons. The one is, you're apathetic. The other one is that you don't believe any of the parties represent your interests, and so you're deliberately deciding not to vote. There is an interesting thing. So in Australia, you have to vote. You can be fined if you don't vote. So you're compelling it. So they have very high levels of voter participation. But my view is that you should have a box that says vote of no confidence, and that should be represented in Parliament by empty seats.
I like that.
And I think it should be that for any legislation to pass, you still have to get a majority, and all those empty seats are automatic no's. And I think that's the only fair way to have that voice heard, if you're going to force people to vote. And it's a way of showing the lack of confidence people might have in a particular government. And, the less empty seats you have, the more support you have. But it's a good barometer. Because I think if you're in a situation where you have to vote for a choice between the fascists and the communists, to say, well, you have to pick one, that's a very uncomfortable choice to make. And you might say, I can't endorse either of these guys. I vote no. And that should be represented in some way.
Well, I think that's a very unique perspective, and I don't recall having heard that perspective before, so I like that. I do not like the compulsory voting. That's an issue I have. I mean, if people care so little about the system that they don't bother to vote or they opt out, that's their choice. I know in America here for a long time we were embarrassed because turnout rates were in the 50s for a national election. People like, this is an embarrassment. And when I was younger and full of piss and vinegar, I'm like, yeah, that's terrible. People should be voting. And as I got older, I realized, you know what? You don't want to participate in a system, that's fine. And then you can complain all you want, but if you don't want to be part of fixing the system, that's on you. I don't really like compulsory, but here in the States, we do elections on Tuesday, which are not optimal. European countries a lot of times do it on the weekend. Of course, in a country as diverse as ours, what do? You can't hold on Friday. That's the Sabbath. You can't hold it on Saturday. Wait, let me get it. Okay, wait. Fridays for Islam, Saturdays for Judaism, Sundays for Christianity, or something like that. So you're going to upset somebody no matter which day of the weekend you do it. But my argument has always been that we should probably do it on a Sunday. Of course, America is a deeply religious and devout country, despite what the press will tell you. So we have over 75%, close to 75% of this country is deeply religious, or at least practices some degree of it. So that might be problematic. But I don't like the compulsory thing. I've never agreed with that. But your approach, that's interesting, Mark. I like that, those empty seats, because I kind of feel that way now. Who do I vote for? Democrats, Republicans? I'm not happy with either option on this side of the Atlantic. And if I was in South Africa, I'm not happy with the DA. Definitely not happy with the EFF or the ANC. UDM's too small. Maybe the Freedom Front Plus. I don't know. It's a tough choice in South Africa. So that is an interesting approach. That's very different than most people have probably thought about. But can you imagine looking at Parliament, seeing a block of 40 seats that are empty, representing all the people that are angry about what's going on in their country? That would definitely send a clear message.
Yeah, I think there's interesting things about whether you have this moral obligation to vote. I have friends who don't vote for a couple of reasons. The one is they say, the line is, if you don't vote, you can't complain. And they say, no. I despise the system so much that I'm not willing to dirty my hands by participating in it. Mm-hmm. The fact that I'm not willing to vote cannot eliminate my right to complain. Mm-hmm. And I think there's something in that. The other one is to say, look, you're doing something that's totally inefficacious. The chances of your vote having any kind of outcome are basically the chances of being struck by lightning 3 times in a row. Mm. So for any individual to participate in a vote is entirely irrational. That'll be the claim. But the view is to say, well, yeah, but of course, en masse, people make a big difference. And so you might think that the individual act of voting is irrational, but the collective act is rational, because you can change the people that govern, and that can have an enormous impact. So there's this funny kind of collective action problem. It's the kind of thing that philosophers and economists get very excited about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The moral imperative is a good point. I think it's a moral responsibility. It's a civic responsibility for citizens in a free society to vote, and I think they should. And I have never missed an election except for primaries, because I wasn't a member of a political party while I was serving on active duty by choice, not a requirement. I just chose to do it. I thought it was inappropriate as a commissioned officer to be a member of a political party, because people ask you questions and then you have influence, unintentional influence, and I didn't want to influence other people. It seemed inappropriate as a leader. But so during primaries from 1989 until 2019, I didn't get to vote. But now I've registered in a political party, not one I'm thrilled to be in, but one I registered to be in so I could vote in primaries. But I agree with the moral imperative, but the compulsory piece is a problem I have a problem with, because look, there's lots of moral imperatives. People aren't supposed to philander. People aren't supposed to, use illicit drugs. People aren't supposed to beat their children. People do this all the time. If you come up with compulsory rules about every single thing on the planet, we'd be incarcerating our entire population at some point. So that's one that's kind of tough. But no, it's interesting. Back to the election piece here, where it's not free and safe and fair. I voted 3 times in person 3 times since this pandemic began. In May of last year, in November of last year, and again in June of this year. I stood in line without facial coverings, maintaining social distance, using good hygiene practices, cleaning my hands after I voted. And I successfully voted and didn't contract any virus, let alone the Rona. And it was safe for me to do. So when people make the argument that it's not safe, and I suppose we could go a little further, go back to about the ability to campaign. That's probably part of the legitimate argument about not being fair. But so far as people's welfare and their safety and their health, I don't think that's a legitimate argument, because I've done it 3 times perfectly safely, and I could have worn a facial mask. Some people did. Now, bear in mind that each time I voted, there was no current requirement to wear a mask, and that's why some people did, some people didn't. I chose not to, and I just maintained a safe distance. But the campaigning, I suppose, is a legitimate argument, but I disagree with that one as well. So, any thoughts on that point? I mean, if I can vote 3 times successfully, safely, why can't South Africans go out one day to vote every 5 years?
Yeah, I suppose my response would be like, a collection of anecdotes doesn't make data, and so you could have a whole bunch of people.
That's fair. You could probably find somebody that stood in line and got COVID.
Yeah. So you kind of want to know, like, what does the general picture look like? And so you want to try and get as much, God's eye view data as you can. We know that, for example, electoral events, I think in the States, India, and Brazil, where there were mass rallies, seem to have led to big spikes. And that comes out in the Moseneke report. We know we did have by-elections in South Africa, and their protocols were observed, and it seemed that there was no spike. And as I mentioned, this ASIQ situation. So it seems like, if you think about how vaccinations run, you have, we're now doing something like 200,000 people a day, as are the Americans, although for you guys it's a lot less than your peak of about 2.5 million a day.
Yeah.
But you could do it in a way that's safe. So, keep the social distance, run it in a regulated manner. So it does seem that there are interventions you can have. I don't think you can guarantee that no one is going to get corona under those conditions. There's always going to be some level of trade-off, but you can't guarantee that no one's going to get corona buying food in a store.
Right, and you can't guarantee that no one standing in a queue for an election isn't going to contract tuberculosis, which is rampant in South Africa. I mean, come on, it's more infectious than corona. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, so you're going to have risks, and people can make a choice. I mean, I think if you compelled people to vote under these conditions, then you might think that there was a problem. In other words, to force someone to take that risk. I think there will be some people who won't vote, and I think that will be a consequence. I think that there will be second-order effects from this. So there are going to be people who are going to lose. In other words, there are going to be shifts in power, I think, for a range of reasons. It's going to be quite hard to work out what those reasons are. Some of it is going to be mass dissatisfaction with the ANC because of a poor track record of governance over the last 5 years. People are not going to vote for them for that reason, which is a perfectly good reason for them to lose power. The other one might be some people say, I don't feel safe going voting for whatever reason. Maybe it's rational, maybe it's not rational. Depends on their, whether they've been vaccinated, what their comorbidities are, etc. And so some parties are going to lose support on that. It's not clear that that's going to track any particular political party. It's described again in the Moseneke report, where it seemed to be pretty even support for postponement or not postponement across political party supporters, at least, not political parties themselves. And then you're going to have the situation where, as I said, we discussed earlier, the ANC just didn't run candidates. And so they're going to be loyal ANC supporters who go to the polls and they want to vote for an ANC guy, they want to vote for the party, and that's not on the ballot. And so now they've got a couple of choices. The one is second order preference. So they pick another party. And it's interesting enough, seems to split. About 30% of ANC voters say they would vote DA, and about 30% say that they would vote EFF. So those parties will probably benefit from some of the missing ANC. But you might have people who say this is not legitimate. The party that I wanted to vote for isn't there, and that's not fair. And so you could have some disruptions afterwards. You could have people saying this new mayor is illegitimate because we couldn't compete properly or our voters didn't turn out. So I think that's something to consider as a secondary order effect. But we shall see what occurs.
Well, I
can say this, which is, in terms of measures to be taken, Moseneke report describes a series of them. The one is these sort of health measures that we have, social distancing, masks, I think sanitizing equipment on a regular basis, that sort of stuff. The other one that I think the IFP had put forward was the idea that you could run the elections over multiple days.
Yeah.
So you would reduce the number of people that were voting. So in other words, I think one of the other ones, you split up the time. So, A to M votes in the morning and M to Z votes in the afternoon. Those are something that's put forward. The RR had suggested something novel, which was the idea of staggering the elections by provincial clusters. So because COVID comes in waves, and because the waves are not national waves, they're provincial waves. So for example, Gauteng went through a massive wave. Is now one of the lowest places in the country, whereas KwaZulu-Natal is one of the highest places. So the waves aren't coextensive, and so the argument was, well, if you're concerned about COVID waves as a reason to not hold the election, one simple way is to sort of have your elections at different times in different provinces accordingly. But the court has made a decision on it, which is you have to have an election between the 27th of October and the 1st of November. So what I foresee will be one simultaneous election on that date. The IR had said quite explicitly, if the court finds that it does not have the legal power to grant a postponement, then it must refuse the postponement. As I say, we will find out when the judgment comes out, when the reasons come out, what the reason for the refusal was. It could be either the court found it didn't have the legal power to do it, or it found that it did have the power, but the facts didn't warrant it. But we shall see when the judgment comes out.
Well, that's what I was going to say. So this release, which is 11 pages, but it's mostly addressees. It's only 2 pages of actual statement here. So I printed out the 2 pages and highlighted the parts I thought were most important. But these 2 pages, so this is not really a decision as such. It's an initial directive, I guess, for lack of a better term. And then the actual court decision with dissent or concurrence would be forthcoming later on, similar to a U.S. Supreme Court decision. Is that correct?
Yes, so we would, I suppose, call it the difference between an order and a full judgment.
Okay,
so
there you go. Okay.
Judgments tend to contain an order, but this is binding. This is not interim. This is the, in other words, the decision of the court, but the reasons are not apparent to us yet.
Now, I didn't read the full Moseneke report, honestly, but you've been consistent. I tried to provoke a response when we spoke last time and said that it seemed that Moseneke was captured. You were quick to his defense to say, no, this is a legitimate, fair report, and it looks at all parties, and I'll accept that. But the thing that I'm curious about was, in that report, did it consider or discuss alternatives in the fashion like the IIR did with this novel approach? And hey, maybe we stagger these elections. Was that part of the Moseneke report too, or no?
Yeah, so the 2 that I mentioned in it are, the one is regarding the times, so splitting up the times of the day, and the other one was having multiple days. What the report does is it basically says, look, we listened to a whole bunch of different stakeholders, and here's all the suggestions that came through, and we're going to systematize them. And so the report is quite an impressive thing, to my mind, to say. It plays totally open cards. It says, here's what the scientists say, here's what the public says, here's what the political parties say, here's what they have 2 different electoral bodies who took different views on whether there should be a postponement. I think it's ISA is the one, and there's another one. So they really try to listen to everybody. It's an unenviable position to be in. And ultimately, just what Moseneke said in that is like, look, I'm not going to weigh in on the law. All I'm saying is that, in my view, based on what I've heard, I don't think it could be free and fair based on the evidence. But there's all these, all those things in the report itself which say, look, might be a very bad time to have an election in February. It wouldn't be safe, and you should have. Karim says you should have the election in October. He says that's, and the worry, of course, was about, could you have a new variant? The case for postponement was largely driven on the idea that we would have more people vaccinated. That the hope was, and this was described as a hope, was to get to 70% of our population by February. And one of the things that Justice Majid said was, this hasn't taken into account vaccine hesitancy. And you're seeing hesitancy in the States. That you sort of reach a saturation point. We will say, I'm not sure if I want this. And we can see it in our data in some sense, because what we've done is say, certain age groups got to go and do it. And there are certain age groups that have been eligible for a while, but we haven't gotten to, very high levels of penetration. And that's why we've, dropped down to 18 now. So everyone, over 18 is eligible to get it. But I think our vaccination levels, I think at the time of the hearing, we're at about 12%. But the idea that we could get to 70% is very hopeful.
But see, the problem with this is these are political lies. These are political lies, Mark. I mean, this nonsense. First off, we were told last year in the States 2 weeks to flatten the curve. That was utter nonsense. South Africa was told 3 weeks to prepare hospitals. There are fewer intensive care hospital beds in South Africa today than there were then, courtesy of the fire at Charlotte Maxeke Hospital, which is yet to be repaired. So these are political lies. The argument that we had to reach herd immunity, that we had to get a certain percentage of people, and then everything goes, that's utter nonsense. It flies in the face of science. I mean, we know that RNA mutates all the time. We see it now. The Charlie.1.2 variant is now prevalent throughout Southern Africa. You got the Mu version. We've got this Delta. We've got one thing after another. And for these politicians to continue to lie to people, this is the problem I have with this all along. You can never have a perfect situation in which you're going to have everyone safe. I mean, just in a normal circumstance, get rid of the Rona, people standing in line with influenza getting people sick, or tuberculosis at election camp queues. This happens all the time in campaigns. This is why this is so disturbing. Israel is the most highly inoculated country on the planet. Sweden just banned travelers from Israel because they've got rampant breakout of coronavirus throughout Israel, and it's all people who are vaccinated. We've seen the same thing in the Seychelles, which had over 80% of its population vaccinated. 40% of the people coming down with it, testing positive, have been vaccinated fully. And now the same thing in Iceland. The list goes on and on. So the argument that these people make that the key is vaccinations, I have a serious problem with. That's not pro or anti-vaccination. Look, Mark, I've said this in my program many times. I've been a pincushion for the U.S. government for 50 years. I've gotten every vaccine you can think of, including rabies, which really is a creepy pink vaccination you get 3 times. And then hepatitis A, B, C. Most people, they want to show vaccine passports. Show me your hepatitis A, B, C, so you don't endanger me because I've been vaccinated. Anyway, point is that I have no issue with getting vaccinations, but to me, that is an excuse because they'll just keep moving the goalpost here. And we see this already, whether there's vaccine hesitancy or somehow they tie everyone down and jab everybody's arm with every vaccine possible. It doesn't change the calculus scientifically. And that's the problem I have with all this argument about, if we have more people. And as you said, the Most Ineki report, they said, well, February might be a bad time. We don't know. We could delay this stuff into perpetuity. And if that happens, that's a complete abrogation of the rule of law and it's unconstitutional. And that was my concern. So it looks like we'll have elections between the 27th of October and 1st November, unless something really bizarre happens.
Yes, a couple of points. So the one is, part of the argument that I made before the Constitutional Court was to say, the true horror show is that a postponement is granted. It's granted till February, and we have some change, we didn't vaccinate enough people, there's a new variant, and the Electoral Commission comes back to court and says, look, facts are different. This court has the power to change its date on this, and we're asking to do so. And the court says, well, if we did it the first time around, based on those facts, I guess we have to do it this time around based on these new facts. And then you do that over and over and over again. And then you never get your way out of it because you're never going to have a perfect scenario. So we'll see if in the reasons that follow, whether that is one of the considerations that came out in the court's judgment about this concern about indefinite postponement. Moseneke, by the way, quite explicitly said that would be very undesirable and that we should only have one delay, and that's why he said Feb is a hard cutoff. Look, on the vaccines, what we do find is that just because you're vaccinated doesn't mean that you can't get corona and you can't transmit it. But it does seem to be the case that you process it through your system much quicker. So there is a benefit for others if you get vaccinated because the amount of time that you're infectious is much less. And obviously the other thing that you find in Israel is, you do have people getting it, but the levels of deaths and the levels of hospitalizations are dramatically lowered by the vaccine. I mean, it's an incredibly effective thing for keeping people, out of the grave and out of hospitals. So there are benefits to it. I do think I understand the sort of line of, the goalpost shift. And there's ways in which that can be totally illegitimate. In other words, the reason why we're going to have a lockdown is to prepare the hospitals. And then it becomes the reason we're going to have a lockdown is because every life is sacred and no one can be allowed to die. Now you've really changed the goalposts about, okay, well, how much does our personal freedom matter here? What kind of utilitarian calcs are we allowed to do? But there's other ways in which you say, look, the goalposts shift because the facts shift. Mm-hmm. So we had certain assumptions about what the virus was. The way you find things out is messy. Science is messy. You have an hypothesis that you generate. You test it through all data. You think this is a good idea. It turns out it's not a good idea. We've had to continually update our knowledge of the virus. And so just because you're updating that doesn't mean that the the scientists were wrong. The scientists are engaging in the scientific process and they're learning more and more. I mean, think about, so for example, something like ivermectin. So you had initial studies that came out, small-scale studies, that look very promising. It was like, look, these guys took ivermectin. They were frontier healthcare workers. I think some of them coming out of South America. It seemed to be that they were getting it a lot less. You're like, oh, this is fantastic. This is great. We should try roll this thing out more. Then you have more studies that come out and more meta-studies, and it turns out it just isn't efficacious. So that's not the science changing its mind. It's just that you get better data, more sophisticated studies, things that are kind of truly randomized control. You had a lot of problems. The problem with running science under emergency conditions is that you're going to make mistakes. You're going to have biases. You're going to, want a certain result to be there. If you're an optimistic person, you think, well, maybe we can twist the data in this way, or you're unaware of the fact that you're unconsciously doing that. That's why you need a lot of evidence to come and a lot of scrutiny, a lot of peer review. And then, you sort of get a clearer and clearer picture. The resolution shifts. And then your political response must shift accordingly. To say, well, we thought it was this way. We hoped it was this way. It turns out it's another way. So, yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's useful is if you have a good idea of what your framework is in principle. So I run the show called Brain Vat. It's a philosophy discussion show. And our first episode was it's called Lockdown, a Trolley Problem. And we sort of set up the different kinds of moral frameworks that you could have to determine whether lockdowns are justified or not. And our view was, we said, look, we don't think our moral framework is going to shift much at all. The facts are going to shift, and the decision that you make is going to shift, but the framework is going to remain consistent. And so there's certain things that you can sort of etch in stone. We have two different kinds of frameworks. The one's a rights-based framework, the other one's a utilitarian framework. They're going to generate different results, but the point is that you can have certain things that are locked in place, certain things you say, this is a fundamental no-go. You cannot do this to people under any conditions, regardless of the consequences. This is one way of thinking about it. The other one, you say, no, you always got to be looking at the consequences, and as the facts change, you adjust what you do based on that. But at least you've got some certainty once you've locked into a framework.
But see, Mark, the thing is that you're trustworthy. I'll take your word. You were honest. You explained things clearly and cogently. You weren't dishonest. You weren't political. You weren't playing games. And see, it's like the people, the climate zealots. The science is settled. No science is settled. That goes against the scientific process. You have a hypothesis, you test it. And I agree with you. The problem I have is these politicians have no humility, no honesty. They tell us how it is. They're wrong. Then they change things and they tell us that, and they back and forth. The worst of these is Fauci. This guy was telling people in the mid-1980s that children were the vector for HIV. How much more wrong could a person possibly be? I know wrong is simply wrong. There are no degrees of wrongness, but I mean, completely wrong. And he's still around. He's been wrong about everything under the sun. And people attribute it to be some great oracle coming down from Delphi telling us how things are. And it's very frustrating. I mean, there has been no flexibility from the National Coronavirus Command Council, a term that seems to have disappeared from the vernacular in South Africa, but one that very much is still destroying your economy and punishing its citizens if there's any scientific basis to what they're doing, they don't share it. Transparency is the key here. And what you just were was transparent and honest. Hey, it puts you in charge of the NCC. You make a decision, I probably won't question it. But Fauci and Kozazani, Talon Bezuidenhout, I don't trust these people for a microsecond. It's very frustrating. But let me break away for a second. I had a question from Kevin Morris, which is really out in left field. He says, off the topic, he did some carpentry work for some lady named Kathy Waddle in Plett. And he wants to know if you're related to Kathy Waddle. I don't know if you are, if you want to answer that, but that's a rather odd question.
I get asked the "Are you related?" question all the time.
Well, yeah, it's usually about diamonds, I'm sure.
Yes, yeah. So never been asked that one before about the Waddles, but no relation. Yeah.
Okay, well, I figured I'd just throw that out there. And then Mala73 gave a $5 super chat. Thank you, Mala. It's very kind of you. And Ronaldo is here. Hey, I didn't realize Ronaldo popped in. My apologies, Ronaldo. I'm behind on the chat. Let me just see. Ronaldo is here. He says the following is not verified. Registration weekend for the 18th and 19th September. Timetable has been amended and approved. I'm not sure. He must have just saw the comment. On candidate nomination system, if you register by law, the candidate has a constitutional right to stand. Yeah, okay. And then Ronaldo says CNS will open on the 20th September, closes on the 21st, so 2 days. Those who had already registered and no intentions to update the list, no need to resubmit. They just need to confirm. Obviously, as a member of the DA, he's getting some information here that the public may not have seen yet. And then he says, proclamation will take place on Monday, the 20th September. Scanners and voter management devices will be used as it provides live environment. Okay. And I said that again. So no papers, as there's no time to capture the registers later. Inspection of the voter roll opens on the 21st, closes on the 23rd. Wow, this is very complicated at this point. Compliance on candidates' outstanding documents to be submitted by the 22nd. And compliance on candidates outstanding. Okay, Friday the 24th. September, it's a holiday notification of multiple lists, 25th September. Anyway, so Ronaldo has got us up to date here. On the 1st of October, issuing the certificates. SV, I don't know what that will happen on the 30th. And then Sunday the 31st, commission will host press. The commission's going to hold a press briefing tomorrow. Well, I'll cover that. And Stan March has just given 1,024 Rand stripper chat. Wow, thank you for that, Stan. That's very kind of you. Thank you. Swarm DJ says, new Brain Nevada episode just popped up. Did you just put one up, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, this is I'll tell you a little bit about behind the scenes of Brain Nevada. So,
Sure.
We are very routinized in terms of when that thing comes out. So Sunday at 7 o'clock, South Africa time. I think there's, something like 80 episodes out once a week. So we do that very religiously, but the recordings of that are done very anarchically because our guests live all around the world. So, we record them at different times. This one in particular, I think people are going to absolutely love. It's with my cousin, his name is Andy Cooper. He got his PhD in philosophy from Cambridge. He studied under Amartya Sen and Honora O'Neill, who are both very, very famous political philosophers. And he basically got involved in this very interesting debate with Peter Singer. Peter Singer is regarded as the most influential philosopher of all time and had this very, very compelling piece that he wrote about how to solve global poverty. I'll give you the very short version of this. Short version says this. Imagine you're walking down the street and you see this 3-year-old girl and she's playing by a pond and she falls in. And you could walk past and let her drown. But he thinks that you would have a moral obligation to go and pull her out of the pond, even if it meant that you ruined your shoes in doing that. You'd have to sort of sacrifice your shoes to save this little girl's life. And he says, if everybody accepts that, then you've got to zoom out and say, this is the situation we find ourselves in all the time. He says there are poor people all around the world who are dying of preventable diseases, dying of starvation. And he says, you could spend some of the money that you earn saving those people through donations. And so he had this idea about, you think about malaria nets or deworming pools, this idea of effective altruism, that you should spend your money in the way that's the most effective. And he thinks a lot of us spend money on things that are unnecessary. And he looks at all those sort of luxury items that people buy. He says, you could be saving lives with this stuff. So this very groundbreaking paper. And so Andy and Peter had this face-to-face discussion about this, and they wrote a series of papers. And my cousin said, you're forgetting something very important, which is all those luxury goods that are made in factories that employ lots of people. They're part of a big capitalist economy. There are all these ramifications through capitalism that are very, very good for poor people. And so his view was that what you want to try and do is recognize the immense suffering of the global poor, but marry profit with purpose. And so that's what this episode is about. But Andy didn't just stop at being a philosopher. He said, you know what? I could be sitting in an ivory tower and I could just be dreaming this stuff up, or I could actually go and do something, which he did. So he started a company called Leapfrog. They started with $100 million and they invested in microinsurance, and they were the biggest microinsurance provider in the world, biggest fund. And they now manage $2 billion. And so they affect something like 200 million people who'd basically been, kept out of the global economy. And so have had this enormous impact on lifting people's lives. And it's this amazing idea that, the capital markets are an incredible way of driving growth, of alleviating suffering, but that largely the poor people had been underserved by this. And so while, lots of people in Europe and the States had, become very rich, those in Africa and India weren't. And so that's what Andy's fund's done. The other amazing thing about it is those people that have invested, pension funds, various companies, have gotten returns of something like 27% a year. Mm-hmm. So it's a real win-win. In other words, you're a poor person, you're getting all these services that are very good for you. And if you're a rich person who invested, you're getting fantastic returns that are beating the ordinary stock markets. So if you want to watch that, it's live now.
Excellent. Well, thanks for sharing that. I also, the information on your social media presence is below the video for anyone who wants to find that. Listen, Mark, I've heard of Leapfrog. If you don't mind, if you could hook me up with him, maybe I get him on as a guest to talk about it. One of my ambitions and goals after retirement from active service is that I sort of missed out on several revolutions that took place over the last 2 decades. Excuse me. By choice, I chose to stay in uniform and make a difference that way. And it wasn't particularly great remuneration, but it was enough to survive, and live comfortably. But back in the 1990s, I was stationed in Italy, and I had gone from the States where I had a Motorola, analog cell phone, flip phone with a little plastic antenna you pull up, that I had a calling area that was about 8 kilometers wide by about 15 kilometers long. Anything outside that cost me $1 a minute to call. And I only got 30 minutes a month for like $45. It was insane. The battery on the phone would die after 3 hours of use. It was crap. I went to Italy. I was stationed there in 97. I went to a local phone. I bought a GSM, had a SIM put in the phone right there. I could call anywhere in Europe for 15 cents a minute US and prepay. And the battery lasted all day. It was exciting. And I could call the US for 35 cents a minute, which was cheaper than using a landline. And I'm like, hey, this is incredible. And that was GSM. And I'm like, and I started thinking about Africa. And I'm like, we don't have anything but plain old telephone system in many places. What if we could have this? And so I had an opportunity to get involved in telecommunications. I missed that. Before that, I had a chance to go work for Excite and Yahoo back around 95, 96. I chose to stay in. I missed that revolution. And then when I was living in Liberia in 2007, I noticed all these people were sending text messages all the time, even though it costs 5 cents US, 10 cents US, which is a lot of money in Liberia. I'm like, these people are crazy. And I would see the people stand in line at the money changers at Western Union MoneyGram, and they're paying 7 to 12% transaction fee for everything. I'm like, man, if somebody could just take advantage of the data on these cell phone systems. And then, of course, M-Pesa came around in East Africa, and I missed that revolution. But the one revolution I've not missed, which still needs to happen in my view, especially in Africa, is retail banking services for the poor. In my view, you can accomplish several things. You can inculcate saving and investing for the future, which in much of Africa is not the cultural norm because natural disasters, short lifespans over history, people are acculturated to live for now and not necessarily tomorrow and save their seed corn. So I'd like to do a social good from that standpoint. I'd also like to bring retail banking services to the poor in Africa. I mean, in Botswana, when I lived there, it was $25 a month to have a checking account, whether you use it or not. I have never paid for a checking account my entire life. The bank has my money. They get to give it to other people, and I get free banking services. Now, I'm not saying it's just, but the point is that I'd love to bring banking services to the underserved in Africa because most banks in Africa, with exception of places like South Africa, they don't exist for clients. They exist for mining concerns and governments. That's who they loan their money to, and that's where they make their money. Retail banking is just a side venture that's more there for the elites and the upper class and the expats for the most part. South Africa is a little bit of an exception. You do have banking services that do cater to the poor, but then, Floyd Shivambu steals all the money from VBS, but that's a whole other story. Anyway, that's something I'd like to get involved in, and maybe I could get him on here, Andy, and we could talk about Leapfrog. Insurance is obviously one of those markets where the poor have been definitely underserved because they can't access insurance services, and it's a real shame. So it's good to see that you guys have that and bringing to that. That looks like an interesting episode, folks.
Yeah, I think it's nice to step out of the realm of ideas and into the realm of action. And Andy's always struck me as an action philosopher. But he also said that the philosophy is what made him be so innovative because it gives you this ability to question the status quo. And a lot of people didn't. They said, well, this is how it's always been. The way that you design financial products is for the rich. And that's how you make money. And, being a questioning person, he thought maybe you can make money by helping those that are the most in need. And he's turned out to be phenomenally right.
Well, absolutely. We saw it with the phenomenon of micro lending initially. The whole concept that, wow, you're going to loan money to people with no collateral and that they're big risk. Turns out if it's done properly, micro lending is incredibly beneficial to those who borrow the money and those who lend the money. It can be very profitable, can give you big returns. It's just got to be managed properly. And so that's when I first noticed the micro lending. I'm like, if you can do micro lending like that, why can't we deliver services so that people don't have to walk around with their cash? I mean, one of the problems we had in East Africa years ago is that the whole system was upset when the Kenyan government started encouraging local subsistence farmers to become commercial crop farmers, so growing maize or growing tobacco, whatever it was. Sugar, so they would grow the commercial product, and then there would be 1 or 2 harvests a year. They go in, the men would take all the stuff to market, they get whatever the market price is. Of course, it's depressed because they're all coming in the same week and selling the same goods, driving down the price. So that's the first problem. Second problem is the men, for the most part, would sit around, drink, and pay for sex with women and blow all the cash, come home, and there's nothing left over for the family to buy seed corn or tide itself over until the next harvest season. And that really upset the social dynamic and caused a lot of problems. But micro lending came back in, and a lot of that was done for women, female entrepreneurs, and that really changed things in a very positive fashion. So yeah, no, it's nice to be able to do something. Now, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool capitalist, Mark. I mean, capitalism is brilliant. I mean, there's 500 million Chinese that aren't starving because of elements of capitalism that have been introduced by China. 500 million Indians have been risen out of poverty. The number of people coming out of poverty in the last 30 years because of market capitalism, true market capitalism, is incalculable. It's a tremendous number of people. But I have nothing against social good. I mean, we're all parts of communities in one way or another, whether we like it or not, and giving back to our community. And you see a lot of good capitalist organizations, market companies, they actually give back to the community. That's part of what they do. And a lot of people say that's callously, that's just for publicity. But you'll notice that a lot of corporations do a lot of lending, a lot of giving, a lot of charitable things without ever promoting it whatsoever. It's oftentimes part of a corporate board's concept of itself that part of its responsibility is to be a responsible corporate citizen. But now, that doesn't mean there aren't bad corporations out there. Yeah. So listen, Mark, you were scheduled to appear on Ronaldo Host's program this evening, but Ronaldo, I believe, has postponed that appearance. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. I'm sure we'll get an opportunity to talk about it. And as we can see, during our discussion, the facts have shifted. And so I'm sure we'll be able to talk about that in some detail on this show about what actually occurs for the next election.
Well, yeah, absolutely. It looks like. So I'll be looking forward to that conversation. And I just want to mention that because Ronaldo popped on here earlier. And I think someone mentioned earlier in the stream that you were scheduled to go on there. And of course, I knew that you and I had chatted ahead of time. So I appreciate everyone tuning in for this stream. Mark, listen, this is a very interesting conversation. We've gone from Jacob Zuma's medical parole to the case that I asked you to come on and talk about, which we're still waiting for the final judgment to come out, but at least we know what's supposed to happen now. And then we start talking about brain in a vat and lending to the poor and insurance for the poor. Quite interesting conversation. Is there anything on your near-term horizon that you're working on that you could share with us that might be of interest to the audience? Or are all your cases super secret squirrel spy stuff? You'd have to kill us if you told us.
Yeah, there are some very interesting things on the horizon, and I will be kept busy for quite a long time. I'm very fortunate to have a practice that is unusual. I get to appear in, the top courts in the land, and I get to deal with like fundamental issues around free speech and hate speech. But yeah, they are reasonably private. But I can update you once we have more hearings. Yes. So the one that is interesting at the moment. So I mentioned I was in this matter of Kwalani, which is probably the most important free speech, hate speech case of the last 20 years. And we now have a judgment from the Constitutional Court, which sets out what our hate speech law test will be. And a lot of cases have been on pause because of this case, that people needed to sort of see what the clarity was, and it's going to have ramifications for what the hate speech bill looks like and what future versions of the Equality Act look like. And there's a case which I also appeared in called Masuku, and the court has just asked us to write further submissions on the effect of Kwalani on that case, and that'll be later this week. And that was a case of Bongani Masuku, who was a sort of trade union member who'd given a speech at the University of Witwatersrand, where he'd said various hateful things about Zionists. And so part of the question is whether Zionist is code for Jews, whether it amounts to genuine hate speech, and whether they were calls to action, those sorts of things. So that's the next thing that I'm going to be involved in.
Well, that's interesting. But I suppose people, that's a tough one, I think, because, when I think non-passionately and I think of Zionists, I don't think of Judaism. Obviously, Zionists are predominantly Jews, but I think of people who are focused on Israel and the restoration of a state and that sort of thing. So I suppose that this could be a very complicated one, and people how they parse it apart. For me, that's a non-emotional perspective. I don't have a dog in the fight, pro-Jew, anti-Jew, just other people who celebrate their faith a different way. But the term Zionist to me is very clear as a historian, but I suppose some people use that as a stalking horse or as a way to attack Jews who are anti-Semitic.
Yeah, you fleshed out some of the ambiguities there. Exactly. There are lots of Americans who are not Jews, who are Christians, who are Zionists.
Exactly.
And very proudly so.
Yep.
So yeah, there's interesting questions around that. But so I get to do all sorts of weird and wonderful things in practice, which is great.
That's pretty cool. Now, since you brought that topic up before we go, I did want to ask this question. There's this legislation or this bill that's going to be put forward, or it is being put forward. I'm not sure where the status of it is because the press reports all over the place, and it affects things like WhatsApp, criminalizing speech and going after people. Is this going to be affected by some of the decisions that you're going to go before the CONCOURT? I suspect probably that's the case because this is about hate speech.
Yeah, so Kwalani will have some ramifications for those sorts of the legislation that kind of regulates speech and regulates speech online. From what I recall, so that there's the hate speech bill, which has been sitting in abeyance for a while, that has just been reintroduced in identical language to its 2018 version. I find this surprising because it's very obvious, given Kwalani, that it is unconstitutional. The court says that the new test is that hurtful must fall out. So hate speech is basically when the words themselves are harmful or they incite harm. They're aimed at a particular group, and we now have quite a large number of groups that are affected.
Indeed.
But then it says, and they must promote or propagate hatred. So we know that you basically have to have harm and hatred together, and that's quite clear from the court. Hurtful taken out. What the hate crimes bill does is it says harmful or hateful, and so that's quite obvious that would be unconstitutional given the requirements. So I'll be doing a submission to Parliament on that. I think the submission date for the public to do it, and they can probably do it through DRSA, is the 1st of October. And also, of course, the hate crimes legislation has criminal sanctions in a way that our Equality Act has civil sanctions. So you might want even tougher sort of restrictions on it, more protections for free speech, because the sanctions are imprisonment.
Well, the thing for me that's really I found very disturbing, and we have it here too, we have similar sorts of things that have passed and people can be prosecuted. I find the restriction of speech to be a very slippery slope and quite dangerous. I'm not a fan of South Africa's restrictions on speech. I mean, for instance, in the case of Vicky Momberg, a woman who was clearly in shock after what happened to her, she was very disrespectful. She was inconsiderate and rude to police officer, but being forced to pay a judgment of thousands of US dollars to the police officer for insulting him and then sentenced to prison as a felon for things she said. I have real issues with that. If people's egos are that fragile, now I get South Africa's special case, apartheid, the history of racial relations, but we've also had contentious racial relations in America. And I find it very dangerous to imprison people for things they say, especially given how so few criminals who do things, murder, rape, loot, are actually prosecuted in South Africa, but they seem to have no difficulty hunting down. Now, it's not just white South Africans; they've also charged black South Africans with these crimes, and but it's very disturbing to me. I don't know if you could give me your thoughts as an advocate. Is it a slippery slope, or is it a necessary protection of people's dignity?
Yeah, so that's crimen injuria case against Vicky Momberg. I mean, it's the first time that we had imprisoned someone for crimen injuria, and crimen injuria is really where you it's a grievous attack on someone's dignity.
Yep.
And you could think that you can satisfy that with a fine, or that it should be totally civil. In other words,
I think it should be civil.
Those two parties. Yep. I do take the view that there are some kinds of speech that do warrant a criminal sanction. So I think, for example, imagine this is the case that John Stuart Mill imagines. He says, imagine you're standing in front of an angry mob, and you implore them to go and kill someone. Mm-hmm. So in South Africa, for example, we had in 2008 a series of xenophobic attacks. And it seems that there's a fair amount of evidence that what you had was speech acts before then. And so you can imagine there's a guy, as a real case, Ernesto Namuvwe, was a Mozambican who was burned alive. And you can imagine that the mob is surrounding this guy. They've got their buckets of petrol and they've got their lighters. And someone is saying, you need to kill him. You need to douse him in petrol. You need to burn him alive. And all they do is say that. They don't do any dousing themselves.
Sure.
I think there's good reason to have a criminal sanction for that person. Another one that I think is going to be non-contentious is I put a hit out on you. I call up an assassin and I say, please go and kill Chris. And I pay him the money. I've just said words. I think that I'm liable for your death if you are killed. I think that's murder through another means. So I think there are some cases where you can imprison someone for words. But I take your point that there is a dangerous slippery slope, and we need to be very, very careful. Very, very narrow number of cases where you imprison people. And I don't think Momberg's case was one that warranted imprisonment, and I do think that creates its own slippery slope. There was a case that happened, and lots of people celebrated the Momberg thing, partly because she was an obnoxious character.
Yeah, but
so
she was. Yeah.
No favors. She had, I think, 5 sets of pro bono lawyers who, she fired. She did crazy stuff in court. Yeah. Clearly not a healthy
not
person.
Sympathetic person at all.
Not sympathetic.
Yeah.
But the problem is, so you have this non-sympathetic person, and so you say, we don't mind throwing away lock her up. Yeah. And then there was a case of someone who was a young mom. I think she had a toddler as a child. She was accused of using a racial epithet. It wasn't clear whether she had. There was no video footage. It was a bit of a he said, she said. And the one view was that she'd said something like, you need to move your fat ass out of the way. And she was convicted and jailed based on the Momberg precedent. The judge said, well, my hands are tied. We've imprisoned this person, so we should imprison you. And so that's a problem. Now, the same people who are upset about the Momberg case looked at this poor woman with the young kids and they said, well, hold on. I'm not very comfortable with her going to jail. Mm-hmm. So there is a worry that we have a precedent-based system in South Africa. You can create a slippery slope, and you've got to be very, very careful about that stuff.
Well, with regards to the things you said, I mean, in those cases, there are other crimes committed. You don't have to prosecute people, in my view, for their speech. I mean, for instance, inciting someone to attack someone is inciting violence. That's a felony in most places. I don't know the exact criminal code in South Africa. I'm not going to pretend to, but I would imagine that's covered. You have a very extensive system there. And then the other case of you putting a contract on me, that's conspiracy to commit murder. I mean, that's a felony. I mean, so your speech doesn't have to be prosecuted. And that's the problem I have, because people who are doing these things are committing other crimes. Now, calling someone the K word or the N word and imprisoning for them, that's ludicrous for me. I mean, the way you stamp these things out is not through legislation and criminal prosecution, but by ostracizing and ignoring the people that behave in that fashion. And in normal society, when people misbehave or act like a deuce or whatever you pronounce that in Afrikaans, act like a jackass, a fool, then what you do is you simply don't deal with them. You ignore them. You stay away from them. If they're political figures, there's sanctions for that as well. I mean, you don't vote for them, or you campaign against them. So that's the problem I have with it, Mark. And it's beyond a slippery slope, like you said. Telling someone to move their fat ass out of the way and going to jail over that's absolutely ridiculous. Maybe she had a fat ass.
Yeah, I mean, the distinction you draw is exactly the distinction I like to draw, which is the difference between speech which is hurtful and offensive and speech which is an incitement to harm. Yep. And I think the incitement to harm cases, you have good reason to punish and regulate. I think the other cases, as you point out, you've got a whole range of other avenues that are available to you that don't require the jackboot of the state.
Absolutely. Well, Mark, I don't want to keep you forever. You did have another appearance, so it's not like you were expected to come on twice, so you're going to get a shorter even than you expected here. But Joe Emilio has popped on, and of course, Joe says, "Good to see you're feeling better, Chris." Yeah, I am. I'm on the mend, and I'm almost there. And says, "Hello, Mark. Great work. Congratulations on the win in this case." So yeah, once again, Mark, brilliant job as a layperson. Although I'm starting to feel like I might be qualified to be an advocate here. So based on our conversation, now, but as a layperson, I want to say once again and echo what Joe Emilio said there. Well done before the CONCOURT. It was a real pleasure seeing you. I don't know if you know this, but I live streamed that hearing for a good portion of the day, and I managed to catch the exciting part when you and Michelle LaRue and the other advocates were up there making the argument against. And I had all the justices up there, and I had myself in a little corner down here. It looked like I was part of the CONCOURT when you guys were testifying, which a lot of my viewers seem to enjoy. So, but anyway, it was brilliant. Well done. And you've got to link me up with Michelle LaRue. She's brilliant. I've got to get her on some point too. But seriously, your cousin Andy, I'd really like to get him on, talk about leapfrog and stuff like that. So any final thoughts for us, Mark, about anything, I don't know, the color of the sky, the color of the sea, anything that's on your mind before we let you go?
I will have one closing thought because Joe is on the stream, which is Joe lives in Cape Town. He came up to Joburg for a day, and it happened to be a really unusual day, which you will all get to enjoy soon, which is that we dressed up as murderous zombies for a music video.
Are you
which
serious?
which was filmed in Cullinan for my new favorite band called Soms Van die Wolf. Sometimes the wolf wins. And the song is about a zombie invasion. It's a sort of Afrikaans metal song, and that'll be coming out sometime soon. And Joe and I had the privilege of dressing up like murderous zombies. Joe also was the guy who got to eat me. I started off as a musician minding my own business, and then Joe came and took a bite out of my neck and turned me into a zombie. So
was you say Cullinan? Was that at the mine or just in town there? What's
in the town? It's a beautiful historic town. We'd filmed that particular sequence on like what looks like an old abandoned railway track, very atmospheric. There's some very cool cameos in it. Yeah, I'll make sure to send you a link when the video comes out.
Absolutely. Look forward to it. Now, I have no difficulty whatsoever of picturing you as a metal musician. You got the look, so. Mark Oppenheimer, it's been a distinct pleasure to have you back on again. Thanks for coming back on the program. It's a real pleasure. And thanks for explaining all of this stuff for those of us who are laypersons to try to better understand what's really going on with this case. Once we get a final judgment out, maybe we'll get you back on the program and you can explain it to us a little bit better.
Absolute pleasure.
All right, well, folks, that's Mark Oppenheimer. Say goodbye. Mark, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. I'll let you drop off there. Okay, appreciate it. Let me put, okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, Mark Oppenheimer, what a brilliant guest. Thanks for tuning in. Stan March, thanks for that massive super chat, brother. 1,024 Rand. Is that based on a binary system? 1,024 bits? I wonder if that's the case. Thanks to everyone who tuned into this audience. It's the biggest audience we've had since I came back from my illness about a week ago, and probably the biggest we've had in a few weeks. So my many, many thanks to Mark Oppenheimer. Always a great guest. It was a real pleasure. What a very interesting conversation from one side of the spectrum to the other, talking about many different things. And he is consistent. You have to give the man that. He's consistent about his positions. Very well thought. I'm looking forward to that music video. That ought to be fascinating about zombies. People just love zombies. So I'm looking forward to that. Also, looking forward to the final decision that comes out of the Constitutional Court regarding this situation. And Mark and I briefly also talked about Jacob Zuma's medical parole. How interesting is that? I called it June 29th, the day the decision or the conviction was made, that he would get medical parole as soon as is possible. And there you have it. Happened pretty quickly. Paulie says, quality show as always. Thank you, Paulie. Bob says, another awesome conversation. Thank you. Teresa says, thank you. You guys are very welcome. Yeah, anyway, so thanks everybody. Joe says, yeah, working on the edit. Well, I'm looking forward to it, Joe. That should be pretty cool. Kind of exciting there. And apparently Mark has a new favorite Afrikaans band, which is pretty cool. Anyway, folks, thanks. Be sure to smash the like button before you leave. This was a very good conversation. We had a lot of folks here. We had some other YouTubers show up in the stream. We saw Joe Amelia pop in there, Ronaldo Jos pop in, despite the fact that he's grieving for his mentor and that loss. But thanks to everybody for tuning in. Thank you for the super chats. Thank you for the likes. 94 people here currently, 115 likes. Come on, get a little bit higher. Come on, there you go. That's a little bit better. 118. 3 of you were sitting on that like button. It's right below here. Smash it. If you're not a subscriber to Chris Wyatt Africa, hey, take a second. Become one. It's absolutely free. We get shadow banned on this channel. We know it. That's one reason why this former 22,000 subscriber channel only has 4,100 plus subscribers, is the shadow banning. Let's overcome the YouTube BS and make it grow, folks. Anyway, thanks a lot to my guest and thanks to my audience. I really appreciate it. Look forward to it. I'll debate whether to do a Night Owls today. I might do it. If so, that'll be in about 2 hours. If you want to tune in, we'll chew the fat and shoot the breeze if you want. Shoot the breeze and chew the fat. However that works, something like that. Thanks a lot, everybody. God bless. I really appreciate your support for Chris Wyatt Africa. And really, thank you very much, Mark Oppenheimer. You were a great guest. As always, it was a real pleasure. Anyway, folks, we'll catch you later here on Chris Wyatt Africa. Go check out my latest video if you'd like. And that video, I'll give you the link on that in just a moment. It's almost nobody has seen it because, I guess because it's Sunday or I didn't advertise it. But it was taking a long time to publish because it's in high definition. 150 people. That's the breaking news about Jacob Zuma. But here's the link to that. Go check it out. Paulie wants to have Night Owls. Okay. I also need to have a members perk stream sometime soon for paying members of the channel. And I'll be doing that sometime soon. Not quite ready for it yet, but I'll do it next few days, maybe before midweek, possibly Tuesday. Anyway, folks, thanks a lot. God bless. Have a lovely day. Be safe. Protect yourself from the bug. Social distancing and whatever it takes. Good hygiene. God bless and have a lovely evening, folks.